Every morning, the courtyard in front of the Fine Arts Building was a lively panorama of rustling leaves, bright flower beds, and the soft tolling of the campus bell. Students scurried past the small garden, rarely giving more than a passing glance. I, however, found myself fascinated by the figure who tended the flower beds. Tall and slender, always dressed in dark pants and a slightly faded green apron, he would kindly guide each petal into place, prune the overgrowth, or reach into a satchel of seeds. I soon realized that he never spoke aloud. No small talk, no humming, not even a cough. He was a silent presence in a world of bustling campus life. I had noticed him the very first week of my sophomore year. Some people called him the Silent Gardener, though most had never stopped to learn his real name. By the second week, I was finding reasons to pass the garden more often, on my way to the library, or even making small detours before meeting up with friends. There was something softly magnetic about his wordless devotion. He communicated with the flowers as though they could understand. With quick, gentle motions, he cut away shriveled leaves, loosened the soil around growing roots, and watered them with a careful, mindful touch. Curiosity got the better of me one afternoon when I finished class early. I stood near the edge of the garden, observing how meticulously he arranged bunches of violas next to clusters of hardy marigolds. He paused, sensing my presence, and looked up. As his eyes met mine, he offered a polite nod, then returned to tidying the blossoms. I wasn't entirely sure how to start a conversation with someone who never spoke, but I felt compelled to try. Clearing my throat, I took a step closer. "Hi," I said, my voice a soft hush in the open air. "Ah, I see you here every day. Do you mind if I watch you work for a little while?" Hmm. He tilted his head, as though trying to decipher my meaning through my tone and expression. Then, without a word, he nodded again and offered me a purple pansy from the bed he was arranging. Tentatively, I slid the stem into my bun, feeling a small thrill at his gesture. He watched me with a half smile that seemed to say, "Thank you for sharing this quiet moment with me." After that day, I began visiting the garden more regularly. I discovered small benches tucked between flowering shrubs where I could read or simply watch him at work. Sometimes I would wave in greeting, sometimes he would surprise me with a new bloom. A delicate pink rose, a tulip, the color of sunshine, a sprig of lavender. Each seemed to carry its own unspoken message, encoded in color and shape. At first, I wasn't sure what he was trying to tell me. Then, after noticing the gentle difference in each gift, I decided to dig deeper into the language of flowers. We had a campus library with an entire section dedicated to botany, horticulture, and floral symbolism. I pored over each volume like a detective searching for clues. Between classes, I would slip into the library's tall shelves and slide out musty, oversized books with elaborate illustrations. They detailed how, in the Victorian era, lovers would exchange nosegays of specific blossoms to express sentiments too delicate or daring to be spelled out in letters. A white lily symbolized purity, a red rose meant deep love, a yellow rose could mean friendship or new beginning. Petunias spoke of an invitation to share time together, and hydrangeas indicated gratitude or a heartfelt apology. Little by little, the words behind his silent offerings began to take shape in my mind. I remember the day he selected a coral rose and gently placed it in my hand. In the language of petals, coral roses signified desire, passion, and admiration. My heart fluttered at the notion that he was perhaps trying to say something beyond a casual greeting. Yet for all the books I read, each flower carried multiple meanings, leaving room for interpretation. At times I felt a sweet confusion. Was a white orchid an expression of pure admiration, or was it simply the plant that happened to bloom that day? One warm afternoon, I decided to break the silence in a different way. I brought him a small notebook with a pen attached. My plan was to offer it as a new channel of communication. He could write down words if he preferred. Nervousness coiled in my stomach as I walked over to where he knelt beside a bed of geraniums. When he saw me approach, he pushed his gardening gloves aside and stood up, wiping a bit of soil from his hands. "Hi," I said, swallowing my nerves. I I brought this for you. I thought maybe you could use it if you wanted to say something." I extended the notebook toward him. He studied the small spiral bound notebook, the corners of his lips turned down slightly, as though he were unsure how to respond. After a quiet moment, he accepted it with a gentle inclination of his head. His eyes were kind but distant, as if he were wary of stepping outside the world he knew. I waited, half expecting him to open the cover and jot something. Instead, he placed it inside his satchel, gave me a nod, and returned to work. My cheeks flushed with an emotion that lay somewhere between embarrassment and disappointment. I'd hoped to break through, but his silence remained intact, unbroken. Still, I couldn't bring myself to regret my offer. There was a sense that something deeper lay beneath his quiet. I began to notice the subtle ways he tried to convey meaning without words. When a breeze would scatter leaves across the freshly raked garden path, he'd gently guide them aside, almost as if dancing with the wind. When I'd arrive with a hectic energy after a particularly stressful class, he'd hand me a sprig of lavender, calming, soothing. His eyes would lock with mine for a moment, and suddenly I realized that he was, in his own gentle way, trying to share in the small storms of my day. One morning I found him hunched over a patch of daisies near the library steps, carefully weeding around them. I crouched beside him, offering to help pull out the encroaching weeds. Together we worked in companionable silence for nearly half an hour. Even though the sun beat down and sweat formed at my temples, I felt an odd exhilaration in simply being near him, bridging the gap between strangers and friends with the simple act of gardening. When we finished tidying, he stood and brushed the dirt from his apron. Then he turned to me, eyes thoughtful, and placed a single daisy in my hand. Daisies traditionally symbolize innocence and new beginnings, a sweet expression of pure affection. My lips curled into a smile that matched the brightness of the flower. A few days later, I glimpsed an official-looking poster plastered on a campus bulletin board. Apparently, the university administration was planning some new construction projects and had scheduled a meeting to discuss them. Rumors swirled among my classmates, something about expanding the athletic complex. I didn't pay it much mind until I heard the newly planned building might encroach on the campus gardens. It struck me then how fragile those cherished blossoms were, how easily the place I'd come to love for its calm and color could be reshaped by bulldozers. And what might happen to the gardener, whose entire life seemed dedicated to caring for them? I attended the open forum one Friday afternoon. Slipping into a seat at the back of the lecture, a few administrators discussed budget allocations and growth projections, highlighting the need for modern infrastructure. "We'll probably have to remove or relocate some of the existing gardens on campus," one of them said, flipping to a blueprint that showed large swaths of green replaced by new buildings. My heart sank. Afterward, I hurried back to the courtyard. There he was, patching up a row of delicate violets. He paused as I approached, seeing the concern etched on my face. I leaned in, voice trembling slightly, and tried to explain the looming threat. I could almost see the question in his eyes. What can we do about it? Over the following days, I spoke with my classmates and teachers, rallying those who appreciated the gardens. A professor in the environmental science department was more than happy to help gather signatures on a petition. I created an online campaign to preserve the green spaces that gave so much life to our campus. Students posted photos of the flowers on social media with heartfelt captions explaining how the space allowed them to de-stress between exams. We set a date for a protest outside the administration building, hoping to raise awareness that these gardens were more than just decorative foliage. They were a vital part of campus culture. Amid this whirlwind of organizing, the silent gardener remained my calm center. Each afternoon, I'd join him in the garden for a moment's relief from the stress of petitions and bureaucratic paperwork. Though he never uttered a sound, his supportive gestures spoke volumes. Once, while I was hunched over a table in the garden, my laptop open, finalizing the details of the protest, he placed a pot of miniature white carnations beside me. My research told me they represented pure love and devotion, a subtle encouragement. I felt a surge of relief that at least I wasn't alone in the fight. Perhaps he too wanted to protect this garden, but didn't quite know how to say it. As the protest date approached, a new challenge crept into my life: midterms. The weight of studying textbooks cover to cover, combined with the weight of saving the gardens, was enough to exhaust me. One evening, I decided to sneak out to the courtyard for fresh air, hoping to find some quiet. To my surprise, I found him still there, illuminated by the dim glow of campus lights. He was gently covering some of the more delicate bedding plants with burlap to protect them from an expected cold snap. Even under the orange haze of overhead lamps, he moved gracefully, his breath visible in small puffs beneath the moonlight. I walked closer, hugging my arms to ward off the chill. He noticed me and nodded, then held out a soft blanket he draped over a bench. Wordlessly, he invited me to sit. I settled onto the bench, feeling the cool wood beneath me as he continued his task of protecting the seedlings. When he finished, he stood in front of me under the moon's pale shimmer. Watching his gentle features, I gathered the courage to press him for something I wanted to know. "Why don't you ever speak?" He listened, silent as ever, and then padded over to his satchel that lay near the roses. From it, he removed the small notebook I'd given him weeks ago. My heart fluttered. He flipped it open to a blank page, the whisper of turning paper sounding like a promise. Then, carefully, he began to write. I leaned in, catching a glimpse of his neat handwriting. "I cannot speak," it read. "I was born without a voice. The flowers are my words." My breath caught in my throat as I tried to absorb the meaning. It wasn't just a choice. He was physically unable to speak. A pang of sadness, or perhaps empathy, coursed through me, but I also felt a sense of awe at how he had turned that limitation into a whole new language. Tentatively, I covered his hand with mine, letting him know that, words or no words, I understood. He nodded, meeting my gaze. "Thank you for telling me," I whispered. He gently extricated his hand and scrawled a second note. I've never had a reason to write before. Tears threatened to brim in my eyes. All this time, no one had given him an opportunity or reason to open up, or perhaps he simply hadn't felt comfortable. Now, here in the faint light next to the garden, he was sharing a piece of himself. I pressed my hand to my chest in silent gratitude, not sure how else to respond. That night, I returned to my dorm with a heart simultaneously heavy with new knowledge and buoyed by a deeper understanding of him. The next day, classes and midterm schedules swallowed me, but the memory of our brief notebook exchange lingered in my thoughts. Finally, the day of the protest arrived. Students and even a few faculty members gathered on the lawn in front of the administration building. We held signs demanding the preservation of the campus gardens. I spotted my friends from environmental science, a group from the art department, and even some passersby who picked up extra signs to show support. In the midst of the crowd, I looked for the one face I most wanted to see. Initially, he was nowhere in sight. My heart squeezed with disappointment, but I tried to focus on leading the chant and lodging our concerns publicly. Then, near the protest's end, I saw him. He stood at the back, wearing his usual dark trousers and green apron. He had no sign. Instead, he held a bundle of flowers tied with a ribbon, a vibrant cluster of different types: pansies, roses, daisies, carnations, and others I couldn't identify from a distance. He carried them as if they were a statement all their own. My chest tightened at the sight. Here was a silent protester whose bouquet spoke 1,000 words. The press coverage from the local newspaper was there too, taking pictures and interviewing students and faculty. At one point, a journalist noticed him holding his flowers and approached. "What's your message?" she asked. He looked uncertain, as if wishing he could reply. I stepped in, explaining softly that he couldn't speak, but that the flowers were his way of communicating. The journalist's eyes lit up with interest. She knelt beside him, camera ready, and snapped a photo of him holding his bouquet. I imagined the headline: Gardens in Danger, Silent Gardener Speaks Through Flower. The day ended with a meeting between student representatives and campus officials. We presented our petition with several hundred signatures attached. While the administrators didn't make immediate promises, they listened. The local news coverage seemed to leave an impression. Where once they had brushed aside concerns, they soon issued a statement that they would explore alternative building plans to minimize impact on the gardens. Though it wasn't a guarantee, it felt like a small victory for us all. With the immediate crisis somewhat alleviated, I felt a weight lift. I returned to a more normal schedule and found time to bask in the joy of the garden once again. The silent gardener and I settled into a routine of daily, silent hellos, usually punctuated by a freshly cut bloom. I grew bolder in my attempts to speak with him outside the realm of flowers. When the nights were cold, I brought him tea. He accepted it gratefully, sipping while we both sat on a bench among the chrysanthemums. Sometimes I'd ask him questions and he would scrawl his reply in the notebook. Each conversation felt like opening a gate that had long been rusted shut. Over a few weeks, those scribbled words turned into longer sentences. It was through one of these written conversations that I learned his name was Orion, chosen by his mother because she used to stargaze on her family's farm. In another exchange, he told me how he'd grown up around plants and found greater comfort in their cycles of life than among humans who struggled to understand his hushed world. Yet, he wrote to me, "You're the first person to ask me what I want to say, rather than just talk at me or ignore me completely." The closeness between us bloomed with each new page of notebook scribbles. One late afternoon, I had finished my classes early and offered to help Orion pot some seedlings in the greenhouse behind the library. I followed him into the hushed warmth. Rows of neatly arranged pots lined the shelves, each housing a tiny sprout. The greenhouse smelled of damp earth and sunlight, a pleasant mixture that made me think of hope and new beginnings. As we worked shoulder to shoulder, planting seeds into small pots, I noticed how the natural hush of the greenhouse embraced our quiet companionship. After the last seed pack was empty, Orion took off his gloves and picked up his notebook. His writing was slower than usual, as though the words were building inside him in a carefully chosen order. At last, he handed it to me. "I want the world to admire you the way I do. You are as vital as these flowers." I read the sentence, my heart fluttering. Glancing up, I met his eyes, soft, intent, brimming with quiet sincerity. Heat flushed my cheeks, but I refused to look away. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, in a surge of excitement, I reached for him, arms circling around his waist in a gentle embrace. He stiffened momentarily, then melted into the hug, as if realizing that this gesture meant I returned his feelings in kind. No words were needed. Our hearts hammered against each other, beating in silent harmony. From that moment on, we allowed the notion of togetherness to seep into our daily lives. I found myself offering to help water the plants between classes or brushing soil off Orion's cheeks when he forgot to wipe his face. In turn, he would leave small posies in my dorm mailbox, nestling them in tissue paper with a short message in our special notebook language. More than once, my roommates squealed at the sight of a budding rose left on my pillow, the handwritten note reading, "Thank you for growing beside me." Our campus lives continued: lectures, study sessions, assignments. Now, my routine included wholeheartedly caring about the garden's future, ensuring the administration followed through on its promise to preserve the space. Though the new building plan had been adjusted to spare most of the garden area, I still watched the news for updates. My biggest comfort was that Orion was no longer facing that uncertainty alone. We walked the perimeter of the new construction site together, quietly monitoring progress. Whenever I sensed him worrying, I slipped my hand into his, gently squeezing in reassurance. Eventually, final exams arrived, bringing a new wave of stress for everyone. One particularly cold afternoon during that week, I hurried across campus in a swirl of winter wind, my arms overloaded with texts. I was desperate for the warmth of the library. At the garden, I paused. Orion was there, of course, wearing a thick scarf. He waved me over with a simple gesture. He rummaged in his satchel and pulled out a small cluster of snowdrops, delicate white blossoms that drooped like tiny bells. According to my floral dictionary, snowdrops symbolized hope and consolation. He passed them to me, pressing them gently into my mittened hand. Then, with a quick flourish, he brought out our notebook and wrote 2 words: "Don't worry." A flood of warmth rushed through me, dispelling the frost in my joints. I tucked the snowdrops into my coat pocket, nodding in grateful silence. Finals were easier to face knowing I had such a tender reminder in my pocket, cheering me on with its gentle presence. After the whirlwind of tests ended, I rushed straight to the garden, anxious, relieved, and hungry for the calming influence of Orion's presence. I found him watering the newly installed greenhouse bed near the fine arts courtyard. Despite the winter chill, some hardy winter pansies flourished there, adding a welcome splash of color. When he saw me, he set down the watering can and fished out the notebook. I giggled softly, realizing how much I loved his quiet, thoughtful approach. He wrote a question: "Will you join me for dinner tonight?" I stared at the words, my heart skipping. Though we'd spent countless hours together, we'd never actually gone on a formal date, at least not in the traditional sense of dining out or enjoying a meal together away from the garden. Warmth seeped into my cheeks, and a grin stretched across my face. "Yes," I said, my voice carrying a note of excitement that echoed in the otherwise silent courtyard. That evening, we ventured off campus to a small cafe known for its cozy atmosphere and healthy plant-based dishes. When we entered, he guided me to a corner table adorned with a small vase of bright cosmos flowers. As we sat, I noticed the anxious flicker in his eyes. Interacting with the world beyond the garden was likely a bigger step for him than I'd realized. We ordered, and I watched him scribble quick notes for the waiter, who, thankfully, accommodated us with patient understanding. Over plates of roasted vegetables and fresh bread, Orion and I exchanged notes in the notebook, giggling occasionally at the unusual yet strangely intimate form of conversation. At one point, I glanced around the cafe, noticing that we stood out. To anyone else, we might have looked like we were passing secret missives back and forth, leaning in with conspiratorial smiles. But to me, it felt utterly natural, an extension of the unspoken bond we'd formed through flowers. Time slipped by, and eventually we realized we were the last customers left. I nodded gratefully to the owner, and Orion left a generous tip. Outside, the winter air was biting, yet I felt warm enough to skip wearing my gloves. We walked back to campus, arms tangled around each other, experiencing the hush of the sleeping university grounds. The paths were empty, sidewalks dusted with a thin layer of snow. Under the moonlight, the gardens took on a spectral beauty, spirals of topiary etched in silver, the greenhouse windows gleaming with a hint of the life sheltered inside. When we reached one of the benches, Orion paused. He withdrew a single red rose from under his coat, offering it to me with a soft smile that reflected a glimmer of moonlight. My breath caught as I looked down at the vibrant petals, the universal symbol of heartfelt love. Tenderly, I accepted. I read his expression, a gentle invitation to share what we both knew was unfolding. Leaning closer, I pressed my forehead against his. My whisper came out faint, as if any louder would shatter the enchantment of that moment. "I love you too," I said. Even in silence, I felt his reply in the way he cradled my face in his hands. We stood there, framed by the winter garden, hearts beating in tandem under the light of the moon. When the new semester started, the campus was abuzz with news that the administration had finalized construction plans. The main expansion would happen behind the sports complex, leaving the main garden untouched. To my surprise, the garden would even be expanded slightly, incorporating a learning space for botany classes. A wave of relief washed over me, knowing Orion's cherished plants would remain and flourish. The campus soon awakened with the earliest signs of spring, buds unfurling, scents sweetening the air, and my blossoming relationship with Orion shining in each new petal he placed in my hand. Classmates who used to ignore the garden now strolled by, smiling at the vibrant surface of color. Each time I passed, though, I'd drop my bag on a bench, walk straight to him, and offer my silent greeting, a warm embrace that said everything both of us needed to hear. He never spoke a single word out loud, but I understood him better than anyone who used words alone. Through the hush of leaves and the rustle of spring breeze, we found a love that grew quietly, tenderly, sustained by the beauty we both treasured. And each time another seed was planted or another bud matured into a blooming flower, I felt our love sprouting roots just as strong and alive, nourished by the silent conversations we shared in petals.